So have you ever really stopped to think about what the single most important ingredient is for a country's success? Today, we're going to dive into a really powerful idea from Mohammad Farouk Rashid's work, the idea that the entire fate of a nation really rests on the shoulders of its teachers.
And this quote right here, this is the heart of our entire discussion. It totally reframes how we see teachers. They're not just employees, they are the architects of society itself. Now that's a huge claim, but let's see how it holds up.
So, here's our roadmap. First, we're going to look at how these architects are often disrespected. Then, we'll compare two very different realities. After that, we'll trace the tragic ripple effects of this neglect, map out a path for real change, and finally, land on the simple equation for a strong nation. Okay, let's start with the core problem. The architect's disrespect. It's this strange paradox where the very people we trust to build our future are often the ones we value the least.
You know, it's worth pausing for a second to think about what a teacher really is. We're not talking about just another job here. They are the launchpad for every single other profession. Every doctor, every engineer, every leader you can think of. They all started in a classroom. Teachers are literally building the minds that go on to build everything else.
And that brings us right back to that key metaphor. If you neglect the architect and let the foundation crack, how on earth can you expect the building, our society, to stand strong? The logic is so simple, and honestly, it's pretty hard to argue with.
And this leads us into a stark tale of two realities. Let's just compare how teachers are treated in some of the most developed nations versus how they're treated in societies where they're undervalued. The contrast is, well, it's revealing.
The difference is just dramatic. In one reality, teachers are treated like executive-class professionals, with respect, with security, with freedom. But in the other, they're often treated like low-level employees, constantly burdened by financial instability and just worried about getting by.
And this is the point that really truly hits home. When the person responsible for shaping the entire next generation is earning so little that their salary feels like it's on par with, or even less than, a daily wage laborer's, you just know the system's priorities are dangerously out of whack.
So what happens when you have a system like that? Well, that brings us to the tragic consequences, the very real and damaging ripple effect that flows directly from this kind of neglect. It all starts with the teacher. Burdened by financial stress, a lack of respect, their focus naturally shifts from passion to pressure. I mean, how can you possibly inspire the next generation when you're just trying to survive?
And that stressed teacher, well, that inevitably leads to a weaker education system. Passion gets squeezed out by pressure, creativity gets stifled, the very light of knowledge in the classroom just starts to dim.
And what comes out of that kind of system? A generation of graduates that just isn't fully equipped. They might have the degrees, sure, but they often lack the critical thinking skills, the strong ethical foundation that a truly healthy nation needs to thrive. And the final domino to fall? The nation itself. An unprepared generation leads directly to national stagnation. The engine of progress just sputters and stalls because its foundational parts were never properly built in the first place.
It really puts it all into perspective, doesn't it? When you see teachers out there protesting in the streets just for basic dignity, you have to ask, if the architects of our future feel insecure, what kind of future are we actually building? But look, this isn't a hopeless story. So let's pivot from the problem to the solution and talk about the concrete steps we could take to build a genuinely stronger future. The big question is, how do we actually make it happen? This can't be about empty promises or slogans. This has to be about deep, systemic educational reform.
Okay, so the proposed plan has 4 key parts. First, officially elevate their status. Give them the financial security they absolutely deserve. Then, it's about granting them the autonomy to really excel. And finally, and this one is critical, it means actually involving them in shaping educational policy.
And look, this is not an overnight fix. It's a long-term investment. But if we start today, within 5 years, the best and brightest minds will be drawn to teaching. And in 10 to 15 years, that's when you'll see a completely new generation emerge. Responsible, honest, and truly conscious citizens. That is the payoff.
Which brings us to our final section and the ultimate takeaway, a simple, powerful equation that connects a strong teacher directly to a strong nation.
This might just be the most powerful argument of all. Think about it. A nation can bounce back from a rough economy if its educational foundation is solid.
But if that foundation, the teachers, is weak, recovery becomes almost impossible. The human capital is so much more critical than the financial capital.
So, I'll leave you with this to think about. When we look at any society, at its priorities and policies, we have to ask a really simple question. Are we empowering the architects of our future, or are we making them helpless? Because the answer to that question will ultimately define that nation's destiny.